Good evening. I am Rudy El Houri. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Tecnoglass lecture series. This is our sponsored series that is themed. Every term we have a topic that is curated typically by a faculty member. And this fall 2025, Beruska Vasconez had the privilege of orchestrating the series for us, and the theme she chose is housing. A very important topic, as you know, given the challenges we have for affordable housing in Miami. We are able to theme those lectures very deliberately and sustain a very high standard thanks to the generous sponsorship by Tecnoglass, which has been sustained now for 9 years. So we are very grateful. I'd like to acknowledge them for their support and generosity. One of Veruska's many ideas for this term is actually also to have the students invested in the series. So they will be talking to you about the theme and introducing our guest speaker tonight. So who has this honor today? Thank you. Matthew. Oh, thank you.
So the Fall 2025 Tecnoglass Lecture Series is titled Housing for All. Across the globe, an extraordinary position is unfolding to re-envision the very foundations of daily life, dwelling, stability, and dignity so that they are not scarce commodities, but shared cultural achievements. In this pivotal moment of climatic flux, geopolitical transformation, and shifting social horizons, architecture can be both sanctuary and catalyst, giving more form to just generous, imaginative ways of living together. Housing for all emerges from the conviction that dwelling must do more than enclose. It must elevate, inspire, and respond. As Jane Jacobs reminds us, cities have the capability of providing something for everyone, only because and only when they are created by everybody. Embodying this ethos, the 5 embodied practices unite intellectual rigor with humane empathy, marrying formal precision to the intricate rhythms of everyday life. Each architect articulates a unique dialect of place, material, and light, yet all share a devotion to crafting spaces at once intimate and civic, abstract, and rooted. This autumn, the Tecnoglass Lecture Series foregrounds their work, architecture that resists the glare of spectacle and listens attentively to the context and community. Together, their projects offer not merely shelter, but meaning, proposing new forms of belonging, intimacy, and collective flourishing. Philippe Wissin, Switzerland. Elizabeth Whittaker, United States. Jean-Christophe Couton, France. Ares Mateus, Portugal. Coldfi, France. Together, these 5 voices provide a compelling response to the call for housing for all. Their architecture acknowledges that housing is not only a right, but a condition for human flourishing. This series is both a homage and an inquiry. It invites us to reflect on the emotional, political, and cultural renaissance these spaces we call home. It challenges us to reconsider housing not as a unit to be replicated, but as a living framework for belonging, for beauty, and for everyday life shared. Thank you.
We are delighted to welcome Elizabeth Whittaker, founding principal of Merge and Architects, as the second speaker of the Fall 2025 Tecnoglass Lecture Series. It is a privilege to have her share her architectural vision and body of work with us. Her practice exemplifies the potential of housing to serve not only as a shelter, but also as a framework for belonging, ecological responsibility, and cultural expression. We're honored to welcome Elizabeth to the University of Miami, where her insight will undoubtedly inspire our students, faculty, and the broader community. Elizabeth Whittaker is the founding principals of Boston-based Merge Architects, a practice aimed at developing contemporary craft, transforming type, and addressing social ecologies across all programs. She is also an associate professor in practice of architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where she has taught core studios since 2009. Merge's work ranges from material explorations to the transformation of housing typologies across the United States, re-imaging the missing middle as a critical site for experimentation and neighborhood. Widely published and awarded, Merge has recently been recognized as Architecture 2025 top 5 medium firm worldwide and #1 popular choice firm. Elizabeth herself has been the recipient of the AIA Young Architects Award, Architectural Records Next Generation Leader Award, and the Architecture League of New York's Emerging Voices Award, and among others. We welcome Elizabeth Whittaker.
Thank you. That was a lovely intro. Thank you. I love that the students introduce the lecturers. That's a first. Good idea. Well, I am delighted to be here. I was here briefly, like a year and a half ago, with a couple of my colleagues for another kind of talk on a studio I taught at the GSD at Harvard, focusing on Brownsville, Allapattah, and Liberty City. So I had my head wrapped into Miami there for a while, and it's awesome to be back. So thank you. Okay. Okay, Merge. So we are in Boston, and we are in the Seaport. The Seaport is a really cool area that was nothing other than surface lots and some industrial buildings, like as recently as 15 years ago. So it's now like the spot to be in the city. The energy there is extraordinary. And that little arrow is where our office is, on the top floor of an old brick and beam building. So, and I live a couple blocks from there. So that's where we're based. However, we work mainly in New England area, but we have been working a lot in various places throughout the US, including Detroit, Jackson, Wyoming, San Jose, California, et cetera, which I'll talk about some of those tonight. This is our team. So we are medium. We're always hovering a little below or above 20. Just to give you a sense of the culture. There are not that many of us. We're smallish but mighty. I have an amazing team, and we do a lot more than housing. So I'm here tonight to talk about housing, because I would say half of our practice is all about housing, ground up multifamily developer work, and the other half is everything else. And so just to give you a sense of our sensibilities about design, we are very much diverse in terms of the typologies we work in, but I think our sense of materiality and how we think about componentry and that kind of thing and how things go together very much translates into how we build buildings, which is housing. So we do a lot of academic for university spaces. We do a lot of workspaces. We'd even do small retail spaces, just giving you kind of a flash of what we do. But we do buildings, and most all of our buildings, not all, but most of them have been housing. And so housing for all is housing urgent. I did a talk a year ago in Toronto. This is a very similar talk, but I called it Housing Medium, Please, because the middle scale, which has been a big topic for several years now, admittedly, really is a problem to accomplish. It's a problem to build at that scale. It's a problem to get through the municipalities to build at that scale. It's a problem to get the right pro forma, et cetera. But that is where I think part of the heart of the problem is with this housing crisis in the US. There are so many sites that are that scale. And I'll talk about why I think it's so important, but also why it's been such an issue. And it is urgent, especially in places like Boston. So the missing middle is defined by like duplexes, courtyard buildings, townhouses, triple deckers, the 6-flat, which is the Chicago type. And so it's kind of like anywhere from, 5 units to just below 50 is what we think of as the middle scale. This is our mayor, Mayor Wu in Boston, and there's several cities like this, which is why I want to run around the country and talk about it, which is there are so many parcels that are the right scale for these smaller site developments. We are 200,000 units short of what we need, according to all the research in Boston. And we're trying to get 200,000 more units online by 2030, which is crazy, but that's what we need in Boston. So that's a lot, right? 200,000, how are we going to do that? How do these little sites even make a dent? We have thousands of these small parcels in Boston. There are thousands of these small parcels in cities like Chicago, et cetera. So how to help solve it? Smaller lot developments. So Boston, snapshot, these gaps between the buildings that you can see throughout this photo. We have, again, thousands of these. And they're not for big developers because you can't do a big building. That's not what they're interested in building. They're for smaller developers. And there are a lot of them trying to make the bottom line work. So Detroit is another interesting site and place where we've been building housing for the last 7, 8, 9 years. They had no building at all for 30, 35 years until about 7 years ago. And now it's been kind of booming and it's amazing. I was at a symposium at University of Michigan a few years ago. That's Maurice Cox, who used to be working with the city during that time, and a few other voices on housing. And again, this whole idea about the missing middle. For example, this was Detroit, full of those small parcels back in 1930. This was Detroit as we found it when we got hired a few years ago to build some housing there. So everyone knows about the decimation of Detroit, the white flight, the issues that they've had and how it's been coming back. It's a very exciting, extraordinary city. But not everybody wants the big buildings. We need them. The big developers want to build them. Some of them are very good. Some of them are very bad. But it is not an urbanism that needs to be, copy, paste, copy, paste. We need a variety of scales. This is a view of a project called Brush Park City Modern. It's a neighborhood in Detroit that Bedrock Development out of Detroit hired a handful of architects from around the country to be a part of rebuilding from ground up. So you can see there are a bunch of different scales of housing, and the ones that are circled were our scope at Merge, and I'm going to show you a couple of them tonight. Chicago, as I mentioned, also has this problem. They just put out a catalog in the past year. They had a competition last year, and they invited a bunch of firms to come in and come up with some ideas for these smaller parcels. This is Chicago. They also have thousands of these sites. They put together this really beautiful book of our proposals, and that one square is ours, which was called the Not So Flat 6-flat, where we had a split level, and I'm not going to get into this one tonight, but just want to show you how the country is trying to tackle this problem and how architects this has been very much a part of the discourse for as of late. So again, how to solve it, smaller lots. Because I just got here, but I think this housing for all discussion and dignity, like I get it, like everybody wants a nice place to live. And part of that is a really great building. Part of that is the neighborhood. Hopefully you get both. And space and having enough room and so on and so forth, and potentially raising a family. So not everybody wants to live in a single family house, but I think we all want a home that feels personal, like a single family house and the ideology of a single family house does. There is something really wonderful about urban living, right? Which is especially the missing middle scale, because, for example, balconies are close to the sidewalk and they're very much a part of the dialogue with the streetscape. And then there's the stoop, right? The history of all the things that happen on a stoop and the kind of magic of the stoop and a cityscape. I think a lot of us, some of us remember Sesame Street. And then, sorry, these are a little dry. I'm going to get to the projects in just a second, but I think it's important for you all to know as well, especially the students. Most of the scale housing that's built in the US requires 2 means of egress, okay, 2 stairs. That's a life safety thing. So it's a hot topic because nobody wants to change it. There's a lot of liability, but Europe doesn't require this. That's why there's one of the reasons why there's so much incredible housing in Europe. And it sounds like, why does it really matter? It's because when you only have 1 means of egress, if you can get away 1 stair instead of 2, you don't have to connect everything with a long hallway. Therefore, you can give back all that space to living, units on the ends, get more windows, and so on and so forth. So there is a single stair egress reform going on. I was part of a couple of panels on this. UTIL, a really great firm out of Boston, partnered with Boston Indicators and the Joint Center for Housing at Harvard to put out this booklet of all the research and why this is a really good idea. So I'm not gonna get too in the weeds, but I wanna throw out a couple of stats, which I think are just important to know. So for example, in Boston, and again, this is like many cities in the US, 75% of our housing are in buildings with 50 or more units. So that's above the missing middle. And so only 15% were in the 10 to 50 unit buildings. However, 76% of our parcels are the size that can only handle the smaller buildings. So they're just not getting built and they're not getting densified. So if we could do the single stair reform, which means that you only need 1 stair and you could go taller with 1 stair, we could double, sometimes triple the potential of the housing stock in these cities like Boston, Chicago, and so on. So it's a big deal. And so what's happening instead is a lot of this. And you guys have a lot of this in Miami. We have a lot of this in Boston. We have a lot of this all over the US. These, I call them big, bad, banal buildings, and they look like this. This is not an urbanism that we're excited about at Merge. This is something that we're trying to counter. And it's not, again, it's not that there isn't a time and place for that scale, but how do you do it well? So back up a little bit about Merge now, get into our work. So I think it was mentioned in the intro, thank you, because it's probably written somewhere. So we are big into typology. We dig in, what does that mean? Every project's a type, right? But how do we tweak typologies within, let's call it the housing realm for tonight, of course. How do we rethink a townhouse? How do we rethink a single loaded corridor? How do we make it better? How do we, insert a courtyard into a new type for a unit, a townhouse unit? I have one of those projects coming up. And then craft is something that modern craft, but also kind of low tech. At Merge, we're not really doing a lot of high-tech digifab. We are doing, that's why I think we talk about making something extraordinary out of the ordinary. We're trying to figure out what to do with very accessible components in our projects. And then context, because most all of our housing projects have to go through a very intense multi-month, sometimes years of community meetings because of the way the approval processes are set up. So that we have to really figure out how we can do contemporary architecture, which is what we do, in the context of sometimes these more historical neighborhoods that don't want more density, and so on and so forth. So we frame the context in various ways, and we also respond to it. So I think our work is not, everything doesn't look the same, although I think there's a sensibility about it that gets repeated, but it is tweaked and tailored and designed and reconsidered for every single site. So I'm going to show you several projects tonight. These are just a few shots of some of them. And so type. So, just like you guys, I walked by Christina's studio today. They're looking at precedents. I've been teaching housing at the GSD for the last 6 or 7 years. We do that whole thing too. We look at the canon. And these are just 3 projects in offices that really stuck out to me before I started even my first housing project at Merge. Narkomfen, which is Ginsberg's really fascinating shared living multifamily in Moscow. Whittaker, which is MBRDV's housing project in Amsterdam, and of course, Corb's Unité in Marseille. And so, yeah, so just that's Narkomfen on the left, the MBRDV project with these barnacles sticking out in the middle in Amsterdam, and then Corb's Unité. And what really struck me about these, and you guys are going to see this if anybody's here from Christina's studio. I don't know anybody here, so I can't tell. And you're all like little heads with this setup. Look at the circulation. It sounds boring, but it isn't. And so what these 3 projects did so masterfully is minimized the circulation, minimized the corridor, so that it either didn't happen on every floor, so that these floors, like in Narkomfen, could be more at the unit, used for the unit space versus the circulation. Can you guys see the cursor? Oh, good. Okay, cool. So, yeah, so the orange is obviously the circulation. So look, there's this big beefy building, and those are the only 2 areas where it's public circulation. The rest is given back to the unit. This is a single loader with Whittaker. They had to have air rights. They couldn't actually land the building any wider than the yellow zone on the site. And so they hung off these units, which is like a super interesting and cool way to resolve more square footage without touching the ground. And then the Unité, of course, puzzles 2 maisonette units, around this central corridor. So 3 stories, only 1 corridor. And of course, those problems, those solutions, I think create some of the most interesting interiors. So just gonna race through here. And then of course, other typologies. Those are kind of building types, circulation types. We're gonna look at duplexes, townhomes, triple deckers, et cetera. And so crafts, again, just a little really fast history. These are the way that we at Merge think about and thought about, especially in the early years, of how to put things together. And we related little projects like this peg wall, which was ours, to projects like MBRDV's Whittaker, which were happening about at the same time. We're scrappy, right? So talk about ordinary. These are just straps that we created this kind of landscaped texture on the wall for a restaurant. And then the idea of the componentry of these boxes for a retail space where objects become kind of interior landscapes. Then they become architecture, right? And niches. And then just the expression of the fabrication and how things go together. So those are the conversations we have at Merge, and then how we started to scale that up into the context of our housing sites. So the first project is one of our first. I always show it first, Marginal 1.0, because we did 3 buildings on the same street called Marginal Street. This is in East Boston. It's on the water of an operating shipyard. It's right next door to it. This is the building right here that we built. And so it's really fascinating because this is East Boston. So it's a working class neighborhood. It's been on the rise, it's getting gentrified. It's wonderful. It has all this potential, but it's been one of the lower income neighborhoods in Boston for decades. And it looks right across, though, has the best views of any neighborhood in Boston back to the skyline of Boston, which is over here. So the seaport area that I showed you where we work is right here where my cursor is. So this is all downtown Boston. This is East Boston. There's a bridge, a couple of bridges that go over there that connect it. And so this was our site, flanked by this warehouse building and triple deckers, right? So what are we gonna do? And so we had this sort of double wide, triple wide site. We did this dumb box. The budget was nothing. And it was right on the water though, which was pretty extraordinary. And so again, back to the 2 means of egress, we had to get 9 units. They had to be really narrow. They all had to have water views. We had to fit all these bedrooms, right? And so we really needed floor through units. And yet we had to get the 2 means of egress to cross grain through them in the middle. And so it became this puzzle of how to maximize the minimum of common space, which is a big equation for the developers. They want as little common space as they can get until you get into really luxury condos and rentals, which have a lot of amenity spaces. None of these projects, except maybe the last one, are about that. They don't have the luxury of actually having that kind of excess square footage or the price point. So it's all about giving as much back to the units so that the sale prices are bigger and the units are better. So this in section was basically, or in concept, were these stacked tubes, floor-through units. We had to carve out, we had to get parking, which has been a beast in Boston for many years. It's changing now. And then have these two means of egress that skewered through the middle of the section. So much about housing is gaming zoning and building codes. Zoning wouldn't allow for more than a 3-story building, but we snuck in a 4th-story in the middle. No one was the wiser because it looks like a 3-story building from the exterior. And we're able to have the top floor units accessible from the floor below, which allowed us to not have to have a corridor in the top floor. So, you know, it's a pretty simple box. Again, snuck in that 2 means of egress, and this shows the circulation on the ground floor. It's separated. Separated on the 2nd floor, 2.5 floors up is the one only corridor in the whole building that connected it and allowed for access to the top floor, which has no corridor. And so again, these units in the middle, which were quirky, became, I think, the most interesting spatially and volumetric because they have all these kind of catwalks and layered space and so on. And that's the top floor. The facade we sold to the neighborhood, they thought it looked very odd next to the triple deckers, the design that we had, but it was a very industrial edge. And so we designed it as a kind of vertical screen that we had somebody sew onto this facade. So bringing back in this idea of assembly and the way that we think about craft onto just the front facade as a kind of vertical growing screen. And just a few shots of that. And then a great view. The thing about dignity, back to that word, that has been set up in your own conversation around this here at the school. You know, part of dignity in housing for me is being able to get outside and breathe. I think in Miami, you have a lot of space, but a lot of the cities in Boston, I mean, in the US like Boston, just don't. And so even when we are designing in these shoebox dimensions, we always try to design into and convince the developers to find a way to get the residents to have private or semi-private space within the building. Another project right down the street from that, same street, we ended up doing 3. So I'm showing you number 3. Number 2 was a lot like the one I just showed you. But number 3 was a really different site, actually sandwiched only by triple deckers. Very narrow, very deep site. We had to fit 7 units, also near the water. But the only way it would really work, and I urge the students who are doing housing studios to really think about hybridizing unit types in your building. Not only does it make for a more interesting demographic that lives there, right? You got flats for singles or studios, and then you might have a 2 or 3 bedroom for families and things in between. So the only way this project would work is if we got really inventive about unit types because it only had a little bit of frontage. Luckily, we had a lot of required setback in the back, which is where this area is. And we sold those back units as townhouse units that actually use the backyard as their front yard. 2 duplex units on the front that had the killer views to the water. And then 2 small flats, which would be the less expensive one, kind of landlocked in the middle. And so it became this kind of quirky, you know, Frankenstein kind of hybrid of different unit types. But it was extremely successful because there was a price point for everyone, and we found a way to design for those middle units light and air and even balconies, which I'll show you. And just to complicate it even more, we were in a FEMA-based flood elevation, so we had to build 1 foot above that elevation. And so we designed it as kind of the back, the green were the townhouse units that were accessed to satisfy the FEMA flood zone marker. And then the front was designed almost as a separate building, even though they're conjoined as one, with a single means of egress. So again, gaming code, this is the townhouses, and also zoning to try and, you know, make this site viable. The middle units, I'll go back one. The middle units are these dark gray ones, had small windows and balconies so they could peek out. We took advantage of the angle of the site so that they actually had views out to the water. And so it was on this, weird kind of 2 axes corner. So we worked with that geometry and created this kind of scissor move, which so many in school build in their models, but the reality is you have to double up structure to pull that off. So instead of 2 flats on top, we did 2 duplexes side by side and just shifted the floor plate up with the one next door, which you can see here in the framing axon. And so those middle units, again, just a couple of views of the small balconies off of those units that looked out and had a view of the water beyond. But you can see it's literally a keyhole. That's the building next door, that little white gutter, and then that's our building. So they barely slipped by. And then some of the shots of the duplex on the top floor. Another project in Boston, these are all smaller and then I'm gonna get bigger, is on the corner on the other side of East Boston, even grittier, on a street called Condor Street, facing a very industrial edge, not with a view of Boston, but in a neighborhood that's kind of slowly starting to develop and evolve. But this was a big corner site. Whoops. Again, a lot of double and triple deckers is the context, and a lot of these small industrial buildings. This white building was the building that we took down, and this is our project site. So we were on this steep slope dealing with this kind of vernacular. And this project, again, couldn't be more than 3 stories. So we were able to carve in the parking on the first floor, which was counted as a basement, even though it's half in, half out. It's a double loaded corridor by type, but the corridor is very small. So the trick with this one was how to give back, again, the circulation to the units. This whole neighborhood is full of extruded, hexagonal bays off of these triple deckers. So we did this kind of idiotic language and did these recessed balconies. And this is the common space, the parking on the first floor. The double loaded is very short. Part of the problem with double loaded corridors is they're long. And so again, we game it back into the unit. Tried to come up with this curved language that would create kind of a counter to the vernacular of these hexagonal bays that have been proliferating the East Boston area for decades, and also try to negotiate that corner of these 2 streets. And then those curved spaces became a way of zoning the interior in a way we hadn't done before. So like a reading nook, and a way to kind of shape and zone these pretty compact units, but the living spaces with them. Okay. So we work a lot in the city, but we're also dealing with the context very different from the city. This is 2 projects in Williamstown, Mass, which is in the Berkshires. I don't know if anybody's ever been there. It's this beautiful mountainous region outside of Boston. And it's where Williams College is, so it's actually pretty vibrant a good portion of the year. But it is a small town. It is very woodsy, beautiful, and along a river called the Green River, and this is the context. And so we got real. We looked at the vernacular barn. We looked at these old vernacular mill buildings. This is actually adjacent and part of our site. That green area is where we built. These were all turned into lofts, which was a project that was before our time, but it is already turned into residential. And so we did a series of duplexes along the river. So there are 14 units in total. Looking at this idea of the contemporary barn and the board and batten, thinking of it as a materiality, a kind of translation from, I think you saw a similar palette in these metal boxes that we did in the city that we're bringing out to the country, and how we still, even though it's very abundant with exterior space, how do we carve in this kind of private and semi-private outdoor space for each of the unit? Each one of these houses is a 2-family and a 3-family combined. And so, looking at really dumb, very affordable materials like white cedar and hardy board. So the hardy board, we just stripped and made this series of battens in this ribbed texture for the envelope that also became the railing. The units, the 3-bed, the 2-bed, this courtyard, we use courtyards a lot in our projects. Even though they're small, they're incredibly impactful. I think this is like a 5x7, but it's a way of literally bringing the exterior into the inside of the space, of the living space, and dividing up these 2 rooms for different living areas. And these are some of the images with that small courtyard. You can see how it affects the interior. Feels like a tree house. And then adjacent to that, a project we call the Modern Mill, which was another multifamily, which really was the transition from the mill building down to the duplex. I was just talking to Rudolph at the reception. He's like, I hate it when people think that you have to transition from a big scale to a small scale in a city. But we could talk about that. But the idea was that this site, the one that's in orange, was a bit of that translation from the historical mill to the duplex. So again, the historical mill, and then this is what we're calling the modern mill, which was just a 2-story, 6-unit building, taking the Batten language, scaling it up to the scale of this building, and adjacent to those what were the river houses. So here we look at the language and the detail of the Batten in the case of the modern mill building as an opportunity to do this custom recessed downspout. So bringing those elements into the language, which started with the barn, into the project. Single loaded corridor. I think out of all the projects I'm showing tonight, maybe there are 9 of them. Only 3 projects had 2 means of egress. We were able to strategize 1 stair. So right now, the code is that we have to work with Massachusetts is no more than 4 units per floor, no more than 3 stories, so no more than 12 units, you can get away with a single means of egress. The whole single egress reform is trying to almost double that. All right, moving on to Detroit, things got bigger. Again, this neighborhood that I showed you before, Brush Park, City Modern, we did what's called carriage homes. Actually, Verisco, how long does the lecture go? No, I know I'm not done yet, but 7:30? I don't want to. Okay, you guys gotta tell me because I don't know. I've got my clock here. So, all right. So the carriage homes, which were essentially like small townhouses, the reason why they're called carriage homes, and that's how they were branded as well, that's how they sold, was because they live and were built inside of these super deep blocks. So the carriage home, by definition, historically, is a building behind a building, right? It's the building that would house the carriages for the house that was in front of it. So this was our site. This is Detroit 2014. We showed up, I think, around 2015, 2016. And this was the whole Bedrock development neighborhood. And so it's crazy, right? Because that was all filled with small parcel buildings back in the day, and then vacant, pastoral, and then there are these extraordinary, at the time, neglected, abandoned brick mansions, beautiful, spotted along that had been, like taken over by squatters and God knows what. So there was an historical preservation architect on the team, and he refurbished a lot of these. There's one right there. But this is City Park, Brush Park, City Modern. It's been in the press a lot because it's kind of a cool story, not just our projects, but the whole thing. Because they literally built a new neighborhood, I wouldn't say overnight, but over like 5 or 6 years. We just finished our last 2 projects there like 2 months ago. And so this is what we were dealing with, but that's how close it is to downtown Detroit. They were smart. They hired a handful of architects to get different voices on it. Those big corner buildings, those 4 are Lurkin O'Hurley's buildings. He's out of LA, Loha, they do amazing work. The stuff outlined in black are our carriage homes, so that was our scope inside these deep blocks. There are a lot of townhouses, real townhouses, bigger ones that face the main streets done by Studio Dwell out of Chicago. And then some of these really bigger buildings were done by Hamilton Anderson, a firm out of Detroit, and they also did the master plan and landscaping. So it was a party. And the meetings were incredible. We all had to think about like, this is before we designed it. What, your carriage homes, if it were a car, what would it be? It's Detroit. So there was a whole conversation around, how do we personify, how do we think about the attitude of these different parcels? And then there are these incredible homes that I mentioned, the brick historical mansions. So the carriage home is the house behind the house. Carriage home is kind of a townhouse. And so those two types were what we were working with. And this is our site. So these are alleyways, which became their frontages that didn't exist before we all got onto the project. So that's why they're in the middle of the block and they're called carriage homes. This was the breadth of it. They literally were stitching all of these peripheral buildings together. There's a really interesting, this cut right here, this image doesn't do it justice, is called the Muse. And it's a really beautifully landscaped pedestrian path that cuts through all these blocks. But the idea was that we were doing a townhouse. The problem with the townhouse is it's narrow, it's deep, the middle of the plan is dark. And so we thought, well, what if we do these paired types that have a small courtyard between them to let light and air in the middle of the deep plan, which is usually where it's dark. So the way, these are condos, these are not rentals. So the way that it worked, one unit, which would cost more, actually owns the courtyard, has transparent windows into it, and the unit next to it that shares it doesn't own it, doesn't have access to it, but has translucent glass and gets borrowed light from it. So it worked out really well. There's these sort of porous blocks of around 10 units each. There's 6 blocks. Those courtyards pop up. You can see them here in the texture of the roof, in between these oscillating roof decks. So the angled roofs actually provided privacy, and we toggled from one side to the other with the unit's roof decks so that they weren't totally adjacent to each other, and then created literally the 5th facade. There was like a whole scene up on the 3rd, 4th floor that you can see here with all these roof spaces that were in communication with each other. The corner units, apartment units also had a lot of common space that would look down onto this roof. And then the kind of homage to this clover pattern, which showed up in all of these mansions throughout the neighborhood, is we did a custom perforated panel. It's very subtle, but that was the actual stamp and the design of the cut. So it was an interesting, new type for us, where the garage was the front door, it was the alley. We created what little bit of dimension we had into these front stoops. So we were really trying to create a social space that was vibrant, but yet private, with these recessed stoops, right? So it's shared, but they had their little bits of privacy. So it was very dense, but also very porous. And so when you get the alleyway, the 2 blocks or the 4 blocks side by side, you get a condition like this. And then just again, the proximity, this is the backside of the project to downtown Detroit. A few images of how that courtyard shaped the interior. This is the middle of the plan. Again, this was going to be the darkest spot, right? So we either had unit types that ran parallel to the courtyard or perpendicular, but they all, of course, let in a lot of light within the middle of the unit. And then again, they're small, but they're pretty magical because they're small and they're not that tall. So they actually get quite a bit of light. A project we just finished a couple of months ago, right next door, very different, we call it D2 because we have another one called D3, but they're basically stacked duplets is what they call them in Detroit, which are essentially duplexes. So we did 2 over 2, right? 2-story units over 2-story units into a 4-story building. Again, minimizing circulation, allowing that top floor to not have any common space because it's has a connection down to its private unit on the floor below. So those were the carriage houses. Right in front are the duplexes. In this case, we were on the main street, and we really did have to respond to the brick and the historical commission to make it more contextual and relevant to that materiality that was, the history of this neighborhood before everything had been torn down. And so this is one of the few double-loaded corridors we've built, but again, we try to minimize the double-loaded corridor. We only have on 3 stories, and we have these stacked 2/2s. And so this was a really challenging budget project, and we were trying to, in the beginning, we had many different forms that were kind of staggering, in and out, and we had to simplify. I think we had 8 different, let's call it, shifts in volume, and we had to get it down to like 4 or 5. And so we really were trying to think about the material of brick, right? As a lot of us have been, especially in the last 10, 15 years, so many beautiful brick projects out there, contemporary brick projects, and how we could think about the patterning of the brick, the texture of the brick, turning the brick, right, into at least a kind of nod or symbol of the 2/2 language within, the building, the stacked duplexes. So that's what you're seeing here is a pattern of kind of a 2/2. Just some plans, pretty straightforward. Every unit is 2 stories. There are a few flats kind of squeezed in there. And then how we designed, again, the assembly of these bricks and how they brought to life the language of the 2/2. So that red building, that's one of Lorcan's corner buildings. So he works in LA. So that's probably the reddest building in Detroit. It's great. And then this image in the bottom right is the building seen from that landscape space I just mentioned called the Muse. So things are, they're just starting to grow, but it's actually a really amazing urban solution to try and stitch these deep blocks together. A couple of views of the interior. So we have mixed a lot of wood with our material palette, either with metal, with brick in this case. And it's been tricky as a material, but I think we're always, in every neighborhood we work in, we're trying to, I think a warm contemporary palette has been a big deal in terms of negotiations with the neighborhoods that we have to work in. I mean, Miami, I know a lot of the students here aren't from Miami, but it's a very different here, and like LA and these warmer climates are, for some reason, more open to these contemporary kind of solutions for cladding systems than places like Boston and Chicago. So the wood has been a big part of our palette on our housing projects because we think it's important. We think it feels somehow more domestically scaled than a lot of the materials out there in the larger kind of above missing middle scale housing projects. So this project, I say this because this is very, very much a project where we explored different ways to use the wood. So this site is Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which is extraordinary, very different from any place we'd ever worked before. It's a Tony ski resort, right? But the problem is they have people who work there, right? And the people who work in places like this never have anywhere to live. They're people, they can't afford it, and yet they work there. So places like Nantucket are having this issue, and any really nice resort, expensive town or destination in the US is having this problem. And so we were hired by a developer to build a workforce housing project, 20 units, so getting a little bigger in scale. Site was incredible, right at the base of Snow King. If anybody's ever skied Jackson, this is Snow King. Our site is right there. That's me and Tyler, best GC ever, called New West out of Jackson. Extraordinary, they were amazing. Built this thing during COVID. Took a long time, but we got there. But the challenge was the neighborhood we were in were mainly a bunch of single family houses. So they didn't want the density. They didn't want the big bulky building. That's our site. This is Snow King right there. zooming in. We're at a cul-de-sac, right? You can see the small scale around us. And then the context is like the Western vernacular barn and cowboys, and I'm not kidding, like cowboys. And they like this, right? The people who go to Jackson go for this, most of them. And so there's this kind of weird mountain modern thing going on out there, and we were like, oh God, okay, how are we gonna fit into this? And so the tricky thing with the building and the zoning code is the zoning code, we had to build one building, we couldn't build three. So we weren't allowed to build three smaller buildings, which the neighborhood wanted. So we had to build one. So, and yeah, we had to get the number of units we had to get and so on and so forth. So this thing is designed to the inch, and we got 20 units, could not have sustained another 10 square feet with all the setbacks and regulations. But the way the massing works is above the first floor. First floor, one building, so we check the box. Everything above it becomes three. That allowed us to do single stairs for each of these three volumes, the point load, and really minimize, like almost embarrassingly efficient, the common space, which is the orange, which is just a landing at the top of the stair that access 3 units, and sometimes 2, on every floor. And so this is housing. Figuring out this puzzle is housing. Of course, making the building look great, yeah, right? You're all gonna do that. But figuring out what is the right efficiency for each project is a do or die equation. It just is. And I'm happy to talk more about that at the end of this. But again, super efficient. The client was awesome. He really loved board form concrete, which was a splurge, but we were able to do that at the base. This is the back with the garages, and then we had this beautiful Kevany wood siding for the upper 2 floors. Used it again. This was a detail we used in the river houses where the cladding and the width of the cladding wood strips becomes the balcony rails. And then how it sits within the landscape of Snow King. So the subtle slope is due south. These are PV-ready roofs. So there's a reason for the orientation of the cant. And then, of course, you know, thinking about the hills and the kind of undulation of the natural topography. It's really an extraordinary place. This is the front, this is that cul-de-sac, and then you can see how the base is all the concrete, but then there are these 3 volumes that float above it. And then that also allowed us to carve in these front courtyards, which became the entries where they would have bikes, right? And then it became like a bench, this whole like little social space. I mean, I think everybody that lives there is like between 20 and 35. There's a real culture and demographic that is around 20 to 35 in Jackson, Wyoming. A lot of people go out there after college and then never leave. And they're doing all the various odd jobs in town. So it was kind of built for that demographic. The units are really modest, but they have these killer views. They have balconies. They're small, but they're meaningful. And here you can see the modest interiors. And then lastly, do I have like 5 more minutes? I keep looking at Veruska. I don't know. 5 more minutes? Oh, perfect. Okay. 2 more projects. Just what's next? Like, so all that, we built it painfully, hard fought, so hard. Housing is so hard, you guys. It's totally worth it, but it's really figuring out all the zoning and building code. Every building's hard, right? But there's something about housing, figuring out the geometry and the way that the units puzzle together and the kind of units that work well together and all, you know, that are market appropriate and so on and so forth. It's tough. So what's on the boards at Merge in terms of housing right now? There are a few things, but these 2 projects are super interesting, very different. Block housing. So the type, I'm calling this block housing because we finally got a big, fat, full block in northern Cambridge. And it's a crazy site, and it's like so good for us because every edge is wildly different. We've got this busy street called Mass Ave, which is a main street that goes all the way through Cambridge through Boston is huge. All kinds of things happen along it. In this stretch, there are a lot of industrial buildings, big buildings like that one right there. They just passed new zoning. Things are going to get even bigger. And then it's flanked by this sweet little street called Alberta Terrace, which are 2 and 3 family units, triple deckers again, and then Cedar Street, which is single family. And we spent, I think, about a year working with the neighbors to talk about what they could live with and what they couldn't live with. And we created a new zoning for the site that would accommodate all these edges, which was not easy. Right now, it's this, low-rise building and then a bunch of parking. But just an aerial, you can see the different context and building scale around it, right? That blue building is our site. That'll be taken down. So that's our site. A lot of this on Mass Ave, a lot of that. The triple deckers along at one edge, the single family. And so what we did is, we looked at maxing it. Of course, that doesn't work for all kinds of reasons. It's too deep, it's too awful. But what we did is we carved and carved for various reasons to find a way to build 2 buildings. And then the big one on the back, let's call it, facing us, is the one that cascades down to the single family street. And so what that allows is that this whole edge really negotiates, the Mass Ave scale along with the 2 and 3 decker houses down to the single, and then provides these really great, very generous outdoor terraces off of those back units. And so that's where it is today. And so this is the view of the building on the single family street side. And so these units will be kind of like, duplexes or townhouses that are embedded within the system of the whole building. So these are 2-story units that have front doors and front courtyards off of them. The rest are multifamily units above and behind. This is the juxtapose the extreme other side, which is the taller building, 6-story building, the mid-rise that's going to live on Mass Ave. And then that really interesting, this is my favorite side, seeing the 2 buildings of the Mass Ave side that cascades all the way down to the single family. That gap is called the retail canyon. So there's a whole concept here about retail that will align on the first floor and create this whole pedestrian zone between them off of the main street, Mass Ave. So a few views into that. This is the kind of the short end of the building. And here you can see the change. So everything in orange, that's the retail space, the whole retail concept kind of within the block. And then you can just see in section how that's going to work. And then there are only 2 units on each floor that actually face the canyon that don't have corner windows. So it's actually pretty good. And those will be the smaller, less expensive units. But if I take you through, you can see how the building sets back. And then the retail canyon. And then last is we're doing our first 100% affordable housing project in Lexington, Mass, which is a really beautiful suburb about 20 minutes outside of Boston. Again, a site that is very contentious because it's surrounded by single-family houses. It's going to be 100% affordable, so a very different demographic is moving in, and we have to do 40 units. This is the site. You can see the context, the figure ground of the single family. And so what we did is rather than having a sea of parking, a parking lot, we created this loop road, divided up the 40 units into 4 buildings that actually look like 8. So borrowing and riffing off what we learned in the Jackson project, how they're conjoined at the first floor, but they look like 2 instead of 1 building above the first floor, the second and third floor. And then actually designing the parking for each unit underneath the building, not underneath as in below grade, but actually as kind of a carport on the first level. So this is an RFP. There are all these 100% affordable developers going for it, and they all had big beefy buildings for the most part, and a lot of parking, surface parking. So I think we won it because I think they love the way it looks, but also because we had solved, this issue of the car. in this wooded lot, which also has a whole lot of issues with the wetland buffer zone, et cetera. So stormwater management is super challenging. So another puzzle. But just a few images of where this is. So this is new. We're in schematic right now. And so the idea in terms typologically, single stair. So we minimized each building so it didn't break the code. There are 10 units, you can go up to 12. There are 3 stories, so we were able to get away with 1 stair per building. And so this gets, this is the unit, this is the building component that gets repeated 4 times. So there's an efficiency, plenty of outdoor space that becomes part of this kind of new social ecology of place for this new community. And then this is the loop road side. You can see how the cars tuck in on that ground level. Simple layouts that come off of that elevator core, which is again, very efficient. A double loaded kind of, but very short. And then again, how the kind of the texture of these sawtooth forms and the way that they are grouped as a series of 4 that actually reads as 8 really creates a variety where there isn't that much variety, right? They're all exactly the same. They just get situated on the site slightly differently. And then a view coming in at the front. And then again, that space in the middle of the site. And then the loop road. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It was a wonderful lecture and very inspiring. We generated some questions. I have some questions here with me that we think will help us understand better the complexity in your projects.
Were they generated before my talk or after? You seem so ready.
It was yeah, we did some research, and I mean, we're very happy that you came and did this lecture for us. So we wanted to be prepared and to help us understand the different solutions that the housing problem has.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that we have is related to the cable mills, the modern mill project, and it goes by so. The modern mill blends 3 traditions: the colonial clapboard, the brick mill buildings, and the modernist abstraction. So while also pushing the sustainability. So how did you balance honoring tradition, history, and regional identity while creating a forward-looking, low-carbon architecture? And do you see this mix as a model for other post-industrial housing projects?
That's a good broad question. I mean, I think abstraction is always your friend in architecture, meaning simplifying, right? I mean, I think everybody, well, I don't know, but so many of us, especially in rooms like this, are interested in contemporary architecture, right? And so what does that even mean? I'm trying to flip back to the modern mill. So the modern mill, the balance was a lot of what I talked about, which was, the scale, it's kind of hard to tell from these photos, but the scale of the windows in these old mill buildings, especially the ones that were on that site, I had a lot of slides. Oh, there we go. So they're huge. These are really huge. But even these are 10 feet tall. So there was a scale to these buildings that we brought in to the modern mill. Okay, so that's kind of a one-to-one, like, duh, we do that, right? Oh, the window, but it felt right. So in terms of honoring, I think that was your word. I did, we were really trying to figure out how do we bring in the scale of the mill buildings, in this case, that way. And we knew we were building those river houses, right? So the modern mill is kind of funny, this building, because I always thought of it, we thought of it as like a big barn, you know, one of these single slope shed barns. So it was, I mean, who are we kidding? It's huge compared to most barns, that, especially the vernacular barns that I was showing. But it was thought of as kind of a weird crossover. Again, we're into hybrids, for better or for worse at Merge. It was kind of like a hybrid of the big barn, which I didn't mention before. The battens, which we were, you know, taking from the river houses, and the real smaller vernacular barns, and then the scale of the windows of the mill building. So it's, you know, it is a little bit of everything, and maybe, you know, we could critique that. That's fair. But there was also this kind of, a lot of our work has a lot of color, especially when you saw our interiors. Like, we're not afraid of color. We used to be. And, you know, we had to deal with some historical commission conversations and approvals as well here on the site. And so these color carves became also a way of abstraction, to use your word, and kind of clarifying the verticality and the language of the verticality. This is, I need to like, you know, of the mill buildings of the window. So sort of like the verticality of those very vertical, proportionally vertical windows of the old mill buildings, making it more overt as a kind of graphic pattern, right? Which are these big rusty red swaths. And then making these kind of big moves of the big carve. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are all the things we did that we thought were responding to, honoring, working with the existing language. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to open for if anyone has a question, and if we still have time, we continue with this ones.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. I have a two-part question. The first part is, how do you intend your buildings to age? In other words, what is the expected lifespan that you've put onto your buildings and your work? The second question is, do you think beauty plays a role in the preservation of historic buildings? Or what parameters do you set or perceive in that regard?
For beauty, or for beauty in historical buildings, or both?
Both.
So, okay, I'll tackle the first one first. The materiality, I hear you. Like, so I'll be honest, wood is hard to master. And we have learned the hard way, and so have so many architects, that you can't control it. Especially if it's solid wood, if it's real wood, right? Now they have all these thermally modified woods, they have these impregnated woods, they have the burnt wood, right? That requires less maintenance or no maintenance. They cost more. So wood has been a real problem with projects over the years. And because you do it right, you put the right finish on, and then the condo association comes in 3 years later because they need to put they need to retreat it, and then all of a sudden you show up and it's like orange because they've put some horrific finish. So you know, the thing about the architects, like, it's our job to design things that last, especially a building. I mean, interiors come and go, sure, but like a building. And so, and then it's also important for us to acknowledge what's out of our control, like what the owner might do to it. So picking materials that are a little more foolproof is something that we are really working on doing more of when it comes to wood. The other stuff, brick, hey, brick's been around forever. I'm not worried. Couldn't be happier, not worried. Metal, so those corrugated metal projects, which were like from here to there to the ocean, I thought, oh my God, they're gonna rust, they're gonna rust. We did so much research before we built the same one. They have 80-year, 100-year warranties, these metal cladding systems that we use. So, felt really good about that. So I think in terms of durability, we think a lot about it. And the only real weak point has been figuring out the wood. And we've We've been using white cedar. We were using Kebony and Jackson, which is turning into a beautiful gray if they let it gray. Our carriage homes were turning into the most beautiful gray. They were a cedar. And then I showed up a few months ago and they were the one that turned red orange, which maybe will go to gray someday because the folks that live there took it upon themselves to retreat it. So the question about beauty and preservation, I'm not really sure exactly what you mean by that. That's a big conversation. But I can tell you that we at Merge find a beauty in projects like this, the Modern Mill, that really try to respect the history and in a real way, not in a tongue-in-cheek way, but in a very, like, our minds think about these contemporary interpretations of, these vernaculars. And so we think they're a beautiful response. We're not into mimicry. I don't think anybody here is. So, but those, it's tough because the audience that we often had to present these to, the neighborhood meetings, the early processes for these approvals, involve a room full of people who don't want anything built. And they certainly don't want anything that looks too contemporary. So I can't tell you how many times I've heard, they see the first rendering, they're like, over my dead body, and then you slowly bring them along with a narrative about how what you're proposing is actually incredibly relevant and good, and how people are gonna love it. And after we build these buildings, the neighborhood's like, oh, I love it. Most everybody. There are always a few that will never love anything. So again, I'm gonna go back to housing. Housing is really hard. It's one thing to build a museum that is a one-off, or even a civic building that's a one-off, or you've got the craziest single-family house on the block that's a one-off. Housing is for all, bring it back to the theme, and you can never please all, but you do have to find a language about beauty, liking it, right? I say a lot in my community meetings when it's getting like heated. I'm like, listen, I'm not gonna live there. I don't want you guys to hate it. It's your neighborhood, it's not mine. So, but I'm also not gonna build, something I don't believe in. So it's hard. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question? Someone?
You're in Christina's studio. Did I meet you today?
No,
Oh,
I'm not.
and I did.
Sorry.
I knew
But
it was
lovely
risky. I was like, I'm gonna nail it. Nope, didn't meet you.
Lovely presentation. I did have one question because you did lobby very hard for the single egress stairs. How do you make it so you're still ensuring safety for your residents
Yeah.
in the buildings?
Yeah, and that's why so many fire departments are, have problems with this change and so on. So I look at this, at the science and the statistics and the reality of what's happened over the last 100 years. And the reality is and I don't remember all the numbers, but in that whole single stair reform brochure, which by the way, I think is online, because everyone's trying to get the word out. They are, the people who wrote it, and then now me, trying to help them and all of us. There are lots of statistics about how few fires or deaths there have been in Europe with a single stair versus the US for other reasons. Like, it's just not a safety hazard that everyone thinks it is. And it has to do with distance from your unit to the outside, right? And the interesting thing about single stair is the corridors are shorter. Yes, I know there's an equation about, half the distance if you have two stairs, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is the statistics show that it is not less safe if you only have a certain amount of units, if your building is only a certain amount of stories high, to do one stair instead of two. So there's a whole conversation and a very impassioned one about the facts that state that it's not a danger. And it all depends on dimensions, right? So it can't be for every building and it can't be for every distance. So, but yeah, that's the question, and that's why it hasn't happened. But there's a reality that it could, given the science, yeah, and the research. The building, the science of a building, yeah. Anyone else? Okay, thank you, guys. Thank you.